So now we'll get started on the adult course. We're going to talk today about commercial banks' balance sheet, the assets, liabilities, and capital.
Hi everybody, you understand what a commercial bank is and how it's different to an investment bank. You know the core functions of a commercial bank. Let's in this video really dig down into the operations of a commercial bank by understanding the balance sheet of a commercial bank. First, what is a balance sheet? Well, a balance sheet is a financial record of all the assets, liabilities and capital, where capital comprises of shareholders' equity at any given point in time. Remind yourself, what are assets? Assets is anything of value that the commercial bank owns. Alright, so anything of value that can be converted into cash owned by the commercial bank. That's a good way to learn it. Liabilities is anything that the commercial bank owes. Right, so something that is owed to somebody else. So deposits, for example, they are owed to individual savers. They do not belong to the commercial bank. Any borrowing that the commercial bank does is owed to the lender. But also capital. Capital is a section within the liabilities component of the balance sheet, and it comprises of two key parts: shareholders' funds and retained profit, also known as reserves. These two things do not belong to the commercial bank. They belong to shareholders. Clearly, shareholders can take their funds out whenever they want. Retained profit, shareholders get that in the form of dividends.
So also understand that a shareholder and a depositor are two different entities. And deposits are a liability, whereas shareholder funds are actually capital.
Right, so capital is the shareholders' equity part of the balance sheet, comprising of these two different components. They are liabilities because the commercial bank owes them to shareholders. They do not own those two things. But it's a separate little section in the liabilities part of the balance sheet there. The balance sheet is so useful. It gives so much information to the managers of the commercial bank, very important, to shareholders themselves, because shareholders can see how their funds are being used to make assets, which hopefully will make profit, right? So important for shareholders to see it, important for shareholders, important for government, important for the Bank of England and the other regulators as well to see the balance sheet as well, because it gives information about liquidity, right? And therefore information about potential bank run, potential liquidity crisis or not. It gives information about potential insolvency, whether too much risk is being taken, too many long-term assets are being held, when there isn't enough capital, right? All stuff we're going to consider later. But basically it gives an idea of the health of the commercial bank too, and those stakeholders will want to look at the balance sheet to see whether the commercial bank is healthy, both in terms of liquidity, both in terms of capital compared to loans that's being issued by the commercial bank. So very important record this balance sheet is here for so many different stakeholders.
So notice how he's saying stakeholders and not shareholders. So the shareholders put in the initial capital, but when you take in stakeholders, these are also the people from whom the bank will be taking out short and long-term borrowing that will need to be paid back later. So stakeholder equals short-term borrowing, long-term borrowing, and shareholders' funds. It's a very big distinction when they're talking about share versus stakeholders.
The balance sheet is not called a balance sheet for nothing. It must balance according to this equation. Assets must equal liabilities plus capital. We know that capital is a part of liabilities. They are liabilities themselves, these two things. So you can think of it as just assets equaling liabilities. And that makes total sense. Because if liabilities is more than assets, it means what the bank owes is more than what the bank owns. And that's not a sustainable position at all. That is how a bank can fail. So assets must equal liabilities plus capital. Let's look down and see in more detail what assets and liabilities there will be on a commercial bank's balance sheet. Well, if we look at assets, I've written them down here, the major assets in order of liquidity. We've got cash, the most liquid asset, notes and coins that the commercial bank will have. Reserves at the Bank of England. Remember from my previous videos I said how all commercial banks in the UK, for example, will have a bank account at the Bank of England.
So for us, the equivalent to that is the Fed.
Whereby when deposits are put into the commercial bank, a fraction of those will be kept at the Bank of England in the commercial bank's bank account and earning interest there. That can be called upon at any time. If depositors come back and they want their money back at any time, the commercial bank can take that money from their bank account at the Bank of England.
Once upon a time, when we would have banks that would do that with the Fed, that was considered a very black mark on the bank because they didn't have enough cash or other assets in order to cover their liabilities, and so that would show that the bank was on unsteady ground. So the bank was oftentimes shamed for going and getting their reserves out from the Fed. That is not the case in America these days. We're talking about bank bailouts all the time from the Fed.
And fulfill the needs of its depositors. So it's very short-term liquidity here, very short-term asset, hence it's number 2 in the list. Money at call at short notice, that's a bit of jargon there. This is any interbank lending that the commercial bank takes part in. Again, the commercial bank can get that money back at any time they want, often daily or overnight. Very short-term liquidity, a very short-term asset.
So this is very important too. Banks loan other banks money. The problem with that is when one bank calls back their money, all of a sudden you've taken away assets from another bank, and rather left liabilities. And so you can actually see a scenario where when one bank takes all the money back that they had given out, other banks start failing, and it starts having a domino effect. This is because of all of the interbreeding between banks, so to speak.
Short-term investments, so the commercial bank is holding short-term government bonds or short-term corporate bonds. Long-term investments, if they're holding any long-term government bonds, long-term corporate bonds, or any shares, that will be recorded as long-term investments. Advances, a bit of jargon here. This is a key part of commercial bank operations. Advances, so issuing mortgages, for example, issuing loans for entrepreneurs who want to kickstart their business, offering loans to firms who want to invest, offering loans to individuals who want to buy a car, right? All the loans that commercial banks will issue, a key part of their operations, advances. And fixed assets, these are very illiquid. Illiquid, think of things like property, think of things like machinery, very hard to convert into cash, right? And same with advances, because they are longer term, mortgages, for example, loans for firms to invest, they're longer term, you can't call on that money back straight away. So illiquid and fixed assets, the most illiquid asset. The liabilities, deposits that individual savers have put in the commercial bank, or maybe firms that have put in the commercial bank, clearly the commercial bank owes that money to its depositors. Very, very short-term liability, because depositors can come back whenever they want. The commercial bank has got to pay that money back straight away. Short-term borrowing, so if the commercial bank decides to borrow from the interbank market or borrow from the Bank of England, these are short-term money market transactions, short-term borrowing there. Long-term borrowing, so if the commercial bank decides to issue corporate bonds to raise finance or issue shares to raise finance, that would be in the long-term borrowing section here. And then,
by the way, that's what the school board is doing. They're doing a little bit of long-term borrowing with the bond proposals that they're putting out there.
you've got the capital part of the liability section, which comprises of shareholders' funds and retained profit, also known as reserves. The commercial bank is liable here to shareholders' money here. Alright, so you've got that section, a key section of the liabilities part of the balance sheet. As we said, assets must equal liabilities. So when we add up our two sections here, they must be equal to each other for the balance sheet to be balanced. Stay tuned for my next video, guys, where we look at different scenarios and how those scenarios will be recorded in the balance sheet. Very useful for you to watch that video to gain confidence of how exactly this balance sheet works and for the importance of the balance sheet. I'll see you in that video.
And here it is for
Hi
that
everybody, you've understood the basics of balance sheets. Let's in this video really get into the balance sheet, understanding it by looking at scenarios and how they will be recorded on the balance sheet. We're going to start with the bank being created by shareholders putting in £25 million of their money into the bank. How will that be recorded? Well, it's £25 million of shareholders' funds. That means that total liabilities is going to be £25 million. Right, how's that going to be recorded on the asset side? Because we know that assets must equal liabilities plus capital. So there's got to be £25 million of assets here. Well, that directly will be recorded as cash. So £25 million of cash there, which means that total assets is £25 million. We have got a balanced balance sheet. The bank now decides to lend £20 million worth of this money out in the form of mortgages and other loans. How will this be recorded on the balance sheet? Well, it's going to be £20 million off cash.
Oh.
Braden has amazed me.
So that's going to be £5 million, and £20 million will go in advances. Remember, advances will constitute loans and mortgages, for example. So £20 million will go into advances, We've got £25 million of assets, £25 million of liabilities still. We have a balanced balance sheet. Now remember that it doesn't have to be a recording in the liabilities section which will match a recording in the assets section, or a recording in the assets section which will be matched by a recording in the liabilities section. What could happen is there might be a drop in one of these assets recovered by an increase in the value of another asset, which still gives you a balanced balance sheet. That's exactly what's happened here. As long as we've got balance between the two sections, we are fine.
Totals have to be the same.
A further £1 million is used to buy IT equipment in this bank. Well, how's that going to be recorded? It's going to be £1 million off cash, so from £5 million there to £4 million, and it's going to be an entry of £1 million in fixed assets. Remember that fixed assets is made up of things like property, of machinery, so IT equipment would fall under that category. We have a balanced balance sheet still of 25 million and 25 million. Things start getting serious now. Depositors come to the bank and they put in £25 million of their own savings into the commercial bank. Well, clearly, that's going to be £25 million of deposits there, and that's going to increase total liabilities from £25 million to £50 million. How's that going to be recorded on the asset side of the balance sheet? Well, I'm going to simplify this and say that directly it's going to be an increase in cash from 4 million to 29 million pounds, which means that total assets is going to increase to 50 million pounds. Right there. Now, it is a simplification because in my previous videos we've learned that what a commercial bank will do when deposits are put in the bank will be to keep a fraction, not necessarily as cash, but at their bank account at the Bank of England. So in truth, what I should have done is I should have put some of this money as reserves at the Bank of England, but just to simplify things, I'll put it all as cash. It's fine for this example, but remember that a fraction will be kept in the Bank of England at their bank account as reserves. Me simplifying it and putting it all as cash doesn't matter for this example. We still have a balanced balance sheet now of 50 million and 50 million. Excellent. The bank now decides to buy up £10 million worth of short-term government bonds and also to lend £5 million out in the interbank lending market. Well, that's £15 million in total, which we will take off cash. So £15 million taken off there, which will take us to £14 million. £10 million of short-term government bonds have been bought up, that's short-term investment, and £5 million has been lent out in the interbank lending market. That's money at short notice there. £5 million that goes in there. We have got a balanced balance sheet of 50 million, 50 million. Great.
So remember here, the bank actually bought the bonds instead of issued the bonds. When the bank issues the bonds, they're asking other people to buy their bonds, which puts it in the liability column. But if they are buying somebody else's bonds, they're basically putting it in their assets column instead.
Let's now say the commercial bank gets really lucky and earns £20 million worth of interest from the bonds that it's holding. Ridiculous, I know, but let's just go with it for this situation here. How's that going to be recorded? Well, immediately, it's an increase in cash from 14 million to 34 million pounds, which increases total assets from 50 million pounds to 70 million pounds. How's that going to be recorded on the liabilities section? Well, it's an increase in retained profit. So 20 million pounds there, which is going to increase total liabilities from 50 million pounds to 70 million pounds. And you can clearly see we have a balanced balance sheet. Let's now say that the bank borrows £50 million from the money markets and decides to buy 5 buildings with total value of £50 million. Well, £50 million worth of borrowing in the money markets, that's short-term borrowing, so 50 million goes there. That will increase total liabilities from 70 million to 120 million pounds. And they buy 5 buildings with total value 50 million. That's going to increase fixed assets from 1 million here to 51 million pounds, which is going to increase total assets from 70 million pounds to 120 million pounds, which means we have got a balanced balance sheet.
Has anyone noticed a problem at this point in the scenario? You've got cash that's about 34 million, and you've got short-term investment and money market that'll get you to close to 49 million. But you've got 75 million in the terms of deposits and short-term borrowing. What happens if all the depositors come for their money all at once in this scenario?
Crucial now, depositors come to the bank and they want £10 million of their money back. How's that going to be recorded? Well, 10 million will come off deposit, so from £25 million to £15 million, which is going to reduce total liabilities from 120 million to 110 million pounds there. Where's the hit on the asset side? Well, it can be any of the short-term assets that the bank holds, also known as current assets. 10 million can go from either of those. We're just going to say that cash will reduce immediately. So from 34 million to 24 million, cash there, which will reduce total assets from 120 million to 110 million. Now this is a very important recording. If ever depositors come back and want their money back, it's these four: cash, reserves at the Bank of England, money at short notice, and short-term investments that will need to pay off the depositors. So these are called current assets, short-term assets, highly liquid assets that will be used to pay back any of these short-term liabilities, which deposits is one of. Okay, so that's how the recording will take place. I've said it's going to be a decrease in cash. It could be a decrease in any of these four parts of the asset section. That's how a reduction in deposits will be counted by a reduction in assets in the balance sheet. We have a balanced balance sheet now, all is good. Let's now say that the bank wants to raise long-term finance of £16 million by issuing its own corporate bonds. Well, that's £16 million worth of long-term borrowing, and that will be recorded there, which means that total liabilities will increase to £126 million, and that directly will be an increase in cash, which will take us from £24 million to £40 million here, which means that total assets will increase from 110 million to 126 million pounds, meaning that we have a balanced balance sheet.
Did you notice though, when a bank is getting dangerously close to insolvency, meaning that the short-term assets are less than the short-term liabilities that it can cover, they can issue out their own set of bonds, and that's long-term borrowing, which will give them and buy them a little bit of time to raise their short-term assets in order to pay off any of their short-term liabilities. That's an important way that a bank can save itself.
Let's now say that the bank
Or a school board
wants to buy up £5 million worth of RBS shares, thinking that to be a safe and logical investment strategy. Bonkers, I know, but let's say that's what they do. And they also want to lend out £30 million to an entrepreneur who wants to develop driverless car technology. No collateral, no security to that, just a simple £30 million loan. How will that be recorded? Well, it's £35 million in total that will be taken off cash. So cash will go from £40 million to £5 million. £5 million worth of RBS shares are bought up. That will be long-term investments for the commercial bank of £5 million, and £30 million to the entrepreneur, which will increase advances from £20 million to £50 million.
Don't buy another pair of glasses until you've seen what this new invention can do. These self-adjust.
No change in total assets, still 126 million, which means that we have got a balanced balance sheet. This is a very important scenario now. Let's assume that £10 million of the mortgages that the commercial bank has issued go bad. Individuals default on those mortgages. How's that going to be recorded? Well, it's going to be £10 million wiped off advances here. £10 million wiped off advances to £40 million. I'm going to make the assumption that the bank doesn't get the house back. So no house is regained at all, which means that total assets will fall from £126 million to £116 million. Okay? Now, in truth, in reality, a house will be gained, in which case there will be a loss in the advances section here, but that might be regained with an increase in fixed assets, depending on what that house value is. If the house value is enough to regain the loss, then fine. If not, then there needs to be a recording in the liabilities section. But we're assuming here that no house has been regained, which means total assets now has fallen to £160 million. What about in the liabilities section? How is that going to be recorded? Well, it's capital that takes the hit, and that's so important for you guys to know. If any loans go bad and they are underwritten, right, they have to be wiped off the balance sheet, it's capital that will take a hit in the liabilities section. If we go into more business-specific territory here, it's going to be a hit in the retained profit part of capital. So it's going to be £10 million lost here of retained profit, taking us from 20 to £10 million, which means that total liabilities will drop from £126 million to £160 million. And then we've got a balanced balance sheet. So the key thing for you to know is that any losses in loans, any loans that go bad, it's capital that will take the hit. That's very important. Therefore, it's important for a bank to make sure that they've got enough capital to offset any losses in loan values.
So wait, let me just stop that for a second, because there's one other way out. So if you lose in the advances column and you don't have enough capital to actually cover it, or you have a bank that is more bent on protecting their shareholders' funds than they are caring about the depositors or the general people, what they can do is they can actually go to the Fed and ask for money out of the reserves. Now, the Fed has the ability to print more money, which means that they can bail out the bank, meaning that the bank doesn't have to take a capital hit and make their shareholders and their investors unhappy. But what does that really do then? Because the Fed is now creating more money, there is more dollars chasing the same amount or fewer goods. That means that the price of goods increases, and you see a massive amount of inflation when this sort of a thing happens, when these banks are bailed out by the Fed.
We have a balanced balance sheet here. Excellent. Two crucial scenarios coming up now, guys. Let's assume first that all the loans that this commercial bank has issued go completely bad. What's going to happen? Well, we know that advances will be wiped out. £40 million lost in advances, which will take total assets to £76 million. We've learned from my last scenario that it's capital that will take the hit. The bank has got to make sure that they've got enough capital to offset the loss of these loan values. Well, in this case, the bank doesn't have enough capital to offset the £40 million loss of loans. They've only got £35 million worth of capital, which means that liabilities can only fall to £81 million, but total assets will be £76 million. Liabilities, i.e. what the bank owes, will be more than what the bank actually owns. That is an unsustainable position. That is bank failure, known as insolvency. I'm going to cover that in my next video in a bit more detail. But if £40 million worth of the loans that the bank has issued go bad, the bank will fail because they don't have enough capital to offset that. Very important for you to know that scenario of insolvency. Another crucial scenario here.
That's what happened in 2008.
Let's say that all the depositors want their money back and all the short-term lenders to the commercial bank want their money back too. That's the short-term liabilities in total of £65 million. For the bank to pay that money off, they need to have short-term liquid assets of £65 million. Does this bank have that? Well, they've got £5 million of cash, £5 million of money at short notice, and £10 million worth of short-term investment. These are the four short-term assets known as current assets, very liquid assets, that can be used to pay off any short-term liabilities. In total, that's only £20 million of current assets, short-term assets, that the bank has to pay off their short-term liabilities, but the short-term liabilities are £65 million. This bank doesn't have enough money to pay off their short-term liabilities. That's known as a liquidity crisis. There'll be panic setting in here and a run on the bank. This is another source of bank failure, which I'm going to cover in my next video. So if the bank doesn't have enough short-term assets, also known as current assets, to pay off its short-term liabilities, also known as their current liabilities, then that is a liquidity crisis. That is another source of bank failure.
So just briefly, how do they get out of a liquidity crisis? They can issue bonds, which is long-term borrowing, in order to raise the amount in the liabilities column, raise the liabilities column, which will give them cash that then allows them to pay off the short-term borrowing or the deposits. But this is what will also happen with the run on the bank, because in this case, they have enough right now to cover the deposits. But if they're calling back the short-term borrowing as well as the deposit at the same time, that's a run on the bank as well as a liquidity crisis.
There'll be panic setting in here and a run on the bank. This is another source of bank failure, which I'm going to cover in my next video. So if the bank doesn't have enough short-term assets, also known as current assets, to pay off its short-term liabilities, also known as their current liabilities, then that is a liquidity crisis. That is another source of bank failure. Stay tuned for my next video where I cover the two sources of bank failure in more detail.
So one last thing about that. Again, the bank can go to the Fed and ask the Fed to print them some money and then give them some money to raise the amount in the reserves of, well, in this case, the reserves at the Fed, and turn that into cash. So basically, the Fed basically poofs the money out of thin air by printing it, adds that to the reserves column for the bank, and then allows the bank to take it from reserves and add it into cash, allowing them to pay off the liabilities, the short-term liabilities. And in that way, the bank can remain liquid and solvent. The problem with that is when you create more money, you have more dollars chasing fewer or the same amount of goods. That's inflation. So basically, who's paying for the bank to stay afloat and alive? You are.